On this Wednesday night, 6 months of Russia's war in Ukraine. The deadly new attack as the invasion collides with Ukraine's Independence Day. And how Putin has unintentionally propped up Ukraine on the world stage. A fresh perspective from Canada's first Indigenous Supreme Court nominee.
I hope my different path will allow it to make a lasting contribution.
Michelle O'Bonsawin's experience and expertise. Returning stolen treasure. The London Museum righting a wrong more than a century later. Plus, the swipe and swap mystery at an Ottawa hotel.
It was beyond our wildest imagination.
Sir Winston Churchill's portrait poached.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Today, an anniversary Russia has been trying to stop. Ukraine is marking 31 years since it gained independence from the Soviet Union. But this Independence Day is unlike any other. A grim one in a country shattered by Russia's invasion, which began 6 months ago to the day. The harsh reality of the war doesn't stop, but in its face, Ukraine remains strong. 6 months of survival, solidarity, and sacrifice, standing up to one of the biggest armies in the world. Today in Lviv, young boys carry the Ukrainian flag during a public ceremony, while mourners pay their respects. Residents in Kyiv gathered in the destroyed central square, children playing on burnt-out Russian tanks. As Jeff Semple reports in our top story tonight, it's a celebration of independence as the country braces for more brutal attacks.
On Ukraine's Independence Day, the cost of their freedom was on full display. A funeral for a Ukrainian soldier, one of around 9,000 killed, along with thousands more civilians over the past 6 months. A new nation was born on February 24th. Not born, but reborn, the president said. We will not give up or forget. The scaled-down annual celebration in the capital was drowned out by air raid sirens, amid fears that Russia might mark the occasion with an attack. Russian missile strikes were reported across the country, including one targeting a train station in southeastern Ukraine, killing at least 15 people and injuring dozens more.
Russia is a terrorist state.
This Canadian-Ukrainian member of Ukraine's Territorial Defense Force says with each attack, Ukrainians grow more defiant. Russia now controls around 20% of Ukraine's territory, mostly in the south and the east. But opinion polls show a growing number of Ukrainians, around 90%, don't want to cede any territory to Russia, even if it meant ending the war.
Whenever the Russians and Putin double down in their terrorist activities, Ukrainians just stiffen their resolve.
But while Ukraine's resolve remains steadfast, there are fears international attention is waning.
There is donor fatigue.
This Canadian in Kyiv is scrambling to help rebuild some of the hardest hit communities before the winter.
In several months, it's going to get very cold in people's homes when they don't have windows, they don't have an energy supply.
To head off the dwindling donations, one Ukrainian volunteer launched a new fundraising campaign. Donors can add personalized messages onto Ukrainian rockets and other weapons before they're fired at Russian forces.
When we stopped getting donations from other people and we decided to try it.
This Canadian purchased a message as a birthday present for his Ukrainian friend.
Happy birthday from Ukraine!
They've raised more than $300,000 so far.
It's a great way of, supporting the troops on the front line.
And that support will be required for the long haul. A war that many thought might last 6 days has dragged on for 6 months, with no end in sight. Jeff Semple, Global News.
According to the UN Refugee Agency, European countries have taken in more than 6.8 million refugees from Ukraine since the war began. About 6.6 million people are displaced inside the country, nearly 1/3 of the population. So far, more than 74,000 Ukrainians have arrived in Canada, with the government vowing to accept an unlimited number. When the invasion began, as Jeff pointed out, many thought Kyiv would fall in days. But Putin appeared to misread the global situation, with one miscalculation after another. And as Eric Sorensen reports, the consequences of his brutal war have made it easy for supporters to stick by Ukraine.
As a smoky haze hung over Moscow on this defining anniversary for Ukraine, Vladimir Putin tried to change the subject. He spoke of forest fires, not the fires of war he set ablaze exactly 6 months ago. His military operation was supposed to be swift and decisive. It was just Putin's first miscalculation.
No one, quite frankly, expected Ukraine to put up the fight that it has put up. But it has been a massive failure for Vladimir Putin and his regime.
Putin also misjudged the unity of the West, the sanctions that have hit Russia hard. He sold short NATO's resolve.
This is an historic day,
which expanded its membership and continues to finance high-end weaponry, giving the Ukrainians a fighting chance.
State-of-the-art stuff is really compensating for some of those numeric superiorities that Putin counted on.
And as global leaders elevated the little-known Ukrainian president, Putin is seeing the West's commitment to a world order that he underestimated.
Putin has got to see that unity of purpose for what it is.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
That, however, remains an open question. Russians who opposed Putin and the war have been largely silenced. It's the one dubious distinction for Putin. His grip on power and propaganda in Russia is unyielding.
Vladimir Putin is really relying on the violent repression of any sort of criticism of his war and on domestic disinformation to brainwash his people into supporting the war.
One other inadvertent consequence Russia cannot undo. It's made Ukraine relevant in the world. Its people, their culture. Who is unfamiliar with this flag now? In the eyes of so many, Ukraine is worth saving, and Russia will have to answer for what it's done.
Russia is coming out of this war with diminished status in the world. At some point, Russian society will have to reckon with the guilt and responsibility for waging this aggressive illegal war.
Russia's unforgettable brutality has achieved something Vladimir Putin never intended. He's made it hard for the world to ever abandon Ukraine. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
The United States is set to send its biggest military aid package to Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. President Joe Biden says his country will send nearly $3 billion in arms, including ammunition, vehicles, air defenses, artillery, drones, and more. And unlike previous aid that was focused on Ukraine's immediate needs, this package is aimed at reinforcing the country's long-term defenses. So far, the U.S. has sent over $10 billion in military aid. Michelle O'Bonsawin will make history early next month when she becomes the first Indigenous person to sit on the Supreme Court. Today, she appeared before a parliamentary committee, answering questions about her career, experience, and judicial philosophy. As Mercedes Stephenson reports, O'Bonsawin's appointment is being hailed as a landmark moment for our country, incorporating an Indigenous perspective and lived experience into the top court.
In
a historic moment, Michelle O'Bonsawin greeted a parliamentary committee in the Abenaki language.
Every nominee to the Supreme Court has followed a different path to get there. And I hope my different path will allow it to make a lasting contribution to the court.
A bilingual Franco-Ontario Abenaki from Odanak First Nation, O'Bonsawin remembers being told as a young person that maybe law wasn't for a girl like her. But that only made her more determined. Justice Minister David Lametti says the appointment is a critical step forward.
The court's legitimacy is enhanced when Canadians see themselves represented on the court.
O'Bonsawin has served as an Ontario Superior Court judge since 2017. Even on the bench, she experienced racism in Canada's justice system.
I could hear a lawyer speaking to a junior lawyer, and at one point I hear that lawyer say, "Oh, she's a native Indian. She's our Pocahontas of the North."
Mental health law, human rights, and privacy law are just a few of the areas that O'Bonsawin has expertise in. She's also an expert in the Gladue principles, which resulted from a Supreme Court decision that lower courts must consider an Indigenous offender's background when sentencing them.
She's going to bring the Indigenous side of things to to the Supreme Court. She's lived it. She knows it.
Carol McBride of the Native Women's Association of Canada believes having an Indigenous person on Canada's top court is essential for sound judgments, especially in areas like compensation, self-governance, and Indigenous land claims.
If there's a decision to be made about our rights, we need to be in the room, and I think that Justice Obanswin represents that for the first time ever in the court's entire history.
And while this is just one appointment, Formsma says she hopes this is the beginning of real change in Canada's legal system and will inspire a new generation of Indigenous lawyers. Mercedes Stephenson, Global News, Ottawa.
RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki took the witness stand today for her second day of testimony at the Nova Scotia mass killing inquiry. Canada's top Mountie said that when 22 people lost their lives in 2020, the nation lost trust in the RCMP. But as Callum Smith reports, Lucki is vowing to do better and has apologized for not meeting people's expectations.
Ryan Farrington lost his parents in the April 2020 killings in Nova Scotia. He traveled from Ontario to Halifax to see the testimony of RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki in person, but his frustrations are growing.
Are any of our suggestions that come out of this inquiry going to be implemented?
During Lucki's second day on the stand, she was asked why it took RCMP nearly 19 hours to search Cobequid Court in Portapique, where 5 of the 22 victims were eventually found, especially given recommendations outlined in a report from Mayerthorpe, Alberta, where 4 RCMP officers were killed in 2005.
I have a commitment to you. I have a commitment to the families. We will look into this. We will figure out why that policy wasn't followed. I can't undo the past, but I surely can change the future.
This, other reviews, and lack of completed internal RCMP review of its response to the Nova Scotia massacre, raising concerns.
Everyone makes mistakes. We understand that these people are not just uniforms, they're people, and that's an issue. But it's difficult to believe that changes are going to be made when it appears clear that the powers that be are more interested in deflecting rather than actually addressing the issue.
Lucki pointed to a national emergency alert policy adopted after the fact, but when it comes to training...
Can you tell me specifically, are you aware of any plans to review training, or have you reviewed training in regards to this mass casualty?
Not specifically and not yet. Obviously, we're waiting. Some of that is waiting till we get the report.
Lucki says staffers are following inquiry proceedings and will review concerns. She admits the killing rampage has shattered people's trust in the force and wants to repair it.
I want to apologize for the RCMP, but in such a way that we weren't what you expected us to be, and I don't think we were what you wanted us to be or what you needed us to be.
The inquiry's final report is due November 1st.
I promised myself, I promised my kids that my parents' death, their grandparents' death, will not go without somebody speaking for them, to get answers, to find out the truth.
Answers, he says, that haven't come so far. Callum Smith, Global News, Halifax.
A deadly disaster in Pakistan. Coming up, the flood-ravaged country pleads for help. Pakistan is appealing for international help as it struggles to cope with torrential rain. Since mid-June, flash floods triggered by an abnormally heavy monsoon season have displaced about 50,000 and killed more than 900 people. 126 people were killed in the past 48 hours, according to the National Disaster Management Authority, most of them women and children. And the flooding is exacerbating Pakistan's economic crisis. A frightening situation for firefighters in Portugal, where powerful winds whipped a forest fire into a fire tornado. The fast-moving funnel of fire and smoke was caught on camera in a national park in the northeast part of the country. So far this summer, more than 87,000 hectares of land in Portugal has been burnt. That represents a full 1% of the country's entire area. Thailand is tightening security as protesters call on the country's prime minister to resign, and as a court decides whether or not his time in office is up. The main opposition filed a petition Monday, arguing the Prime Minister's time as military chief should count toward the 8-year term limit there. Prayut Chan-o-cha has been suspended from official duties. He himself launched a coup in 2014, overthrowing the country's democratically elected government. He was head of the military for 5 years and then continued on as prime minister after winning the election in 2019, an election that pro-democracy campaigners say was rigged. Long threatened by human activity, the gentle marine mammal, the dugong, is now functionally extinct in southern China. Also known as the sea cow, dugongs have inhabited China's southern waters for hundreds of years. Researchers say that widespread habitat loss, hunting, and water pollution have all contributed to their demise. The species was classified as a protected animal in the region in 1988, but the authors of a new study say they were unable to find any evidence that the creatures still remain. They don't belong in a museum ahead the efforts to return stolen artifacts to their rightful place. Members of the Nisga'a First Nation community in British Columbia traveled to Scotland this week to begin the process of returning a totem pole taken from them almost a century ago. Now, that trip comes as museums all around the world reassess items in their collections and consider how they were taken in the first place. As Redmond Shannon reports, some of the thousands of bronze artifacts stolen from Nigeria in 1897 are now heading back home too.
The bronze casters of Benin City, Nigeria. For centuries, their craft has been passed down through generations. But thousands of the most famous Benin bronzes dating back to the 1200s were stolen by British colonizers in 1897.
Each of the objects so taken away represented an ancestor in captivity, not just an artwork.
The Benin bronzes ended up in museums around the world. More than 900 are still here in the British Museum. But now there is a movement from some to return them.
It was wrong to take the bronzes. It was wrong to keep them.
Germany is sending back more than 1,000. Some British universities and smaller museums are doing the same. For curators in Nigeria, it's a homecoming.
All of us are expectant and we're happy about it. And like I said, the ancestors are returning.
Many museums in the West have argued that items would get lost, stolen or damaged if returned to Nigeria. On the contrary, experts say that is often what happens when they're taken away.
We have examples across the world where so many museums can't even say how many of the Benin items they hold in the collection because there is not transparency about what's in the storerooms.
The Canadian Museum of History says its intent is to eventually return its 2 Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. At the same time, museums around the world have been making moves to return artefacts and remains to First Nations in Canada. This week, members of the Nisga'a First Nation visited the National Museum of Scotland to begin the process of returning a stolen totem pole. Professor Dan Hicks says all museums need to look closer at their collections.
We can't be, treating one form of theft in the rightful way while hiding away these other issues in the storerooms or refusing to speak about them.
After centuries of theft, the process to return artefacts of living cultures to their rightful homes is one that is going to take decades. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Next, hotel heist. How did this priceless portrait in Ottawa get swiped under everyone's noses? Now to the mystery and investigation into an art heist at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. This photograph of Sir Winston Churchill hanging in the hotel's reading lounge since 1998 was stolen and swapped out with a fake about 8 months ago. The original one is one of the most famous portraits of the former British Prime Minister. And as Dan Spector explains, the copy was so similar, nobody noticed the famed piece was missing until now.
Ottawa's storied Chateau Laurier Hotel needs your help to solve a Hollywood-caliber caper that's captivating art lovers the world over.
For us, it means the world.
Since 1998, the hotel's reading room was home to a unique print of world-renowned Armenian-Canadian photographer Yusuf Karsh's famous roaring lion picture of former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. But late last week, a maintenance worker noticed it was hanging by a wire instead of anchors.
So then we knew it was probably a copy. It was confirmed this Saturday by the Karsh estate.
Longtime friend and associate of the late artist Jerry Fielder took one look and confirmed the original version gifted to the hotel by Karsh himself had been swapped out for a fake. Nobody noticed for over 8 months.
I think he would be shocked and amazed and disappointed that someone would do this.
In 1941, as the Second World War raged on European soil, Churchill visited Ottawa, delivering a stirring address to the House of Commons.
To fight on in unity together.
It was after that speech that the celebrated photographer captured the iconic photo that even appears on the British £5 note. The legendary scowl came after Karsh took the cigar out of Churchill's mouth.
It became what we would say today viral.
This expert in recovering stolen art says because Karsh lived and worked at the hotel for 20 years, the portrait's value is likely in the 6-figure range.
It's quite possible that a insider was involved.
The hotel has now removed other famous works as it reevaluates security. Authorities believe the swap took place between December 25th and January 6th. The hope is the public can help figure out exactly when it happened by sharing photos they may have taken with the portrait in the background.
I think somehow we're going to find who did this.
Any clues, any earring of somebody trying to sell that portrait, we would love to know.
Karsh's friend says police have been doing an excellent job. Dan Spector, Global News, Montreal.
Out of a movie. That's Global National for this Wednesday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole team here at Global National, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's Your Canada is Burdett, Alberta. We love seeing your Canada, so please keep emailing us those photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.